Drag City interview, January 2011. This is Ed Askew. You made one of the lost crown jewels of psych folk music in the late 60s called Ask the Unicorn. What was your main influence at the time? Which artists and maybe which genre? Because your music on album is so different. Different than what? I was listening to lots of kinds of stuff. That was 1968. That came out, so it was probably recorded 67 or early 68. I went to Yale Art School. I graduated in 66. And I started writing songs around that time. So what I was listening to just while I was in the art school, graduate school, I was listening to Bob Dylan, which was new to me, and I was listening to Kurt Weill. I loved Kurt Weill. I had up till that point been listening to, since high school, I'd been listening to mostly classical music, although when I was a teenager I listened to Elvis Presley and that stuff. And then in college I got interested in, like I say, Kurt Weill and Harry Parch, and anything that was weird or experimental. Like I love John Cage. Also, John Cage came and I think on 3 occasions gave talks at Yale. So we were influenced by those people, and I was influenced by those people. When I got out of Yale, I started, around the time I started writing songs, I started listening to some of the better folk-related artists like Dylan and Joni Mitchell. Not so much the political stuff, also the Grateful Dead and the well-known bands, the Woodstock bands, the well-known bands, all those people. And I also was listening to a lot of Beatles, Rolling Stone, all the pop groups. I didn't hear anything that would be now called, or very little called, like local bands, like indie music. The kind of bands people are always asking me about. They're sure I know about them because I get related to psych folk, what's now called psych folk, and I get related to early indie music. But at the time, I never heard any of that stuff, and I didn't particularly like it when I did hear it. Also, since I'm a painter, at least with my music, I was interested in at least the English translation of Garcia Lorca and the Surrealist poets to some extent. What else besides music did influence you to make Ask the Unicorn? Of course, one doesn't think about it that way. You just you start trying to figure out how to make a song, and the only thing you think about, you don't think about styles. You just think about finding a chord progression that is interesting, like a little composition. And then you try to find some words, and then the words have to do with maybe your personal life, maybe issues that concern you. I mean, I might have been interested, the Vietnam War was going on, so I might have been interested in, that certainly had an influence on what I wrote. Ask the Unicorn, the song Ask the Unicorn is really about the Vietnam, and it's full of metaphors for people who were fighting the war. After I got out of Yale, I got a job working at a private school, a co-ed school. It was most of the kids didn't live there, but but there were a handful of kids who lived in the small dormitory. And for a while, I was in charge of the dormitory. And while I didn't have quite a handle on how to teach yet, I was much better later on. I did become friends with some of the kids. And so some of the songs, like Peter and David, and some of the other songs in that album were related to not so much events in that school, but just situations in the school, or maybe characters that I used who were some of the students. whatever your world is at the time. You draw on whatever your world is to help you make songs. Can you tell me more about how it was all recorded? How it was recorded? Well, I am trying to remember. Bernard, I don't remember who called me or whether Bernard called me, but I was told to come, that I should come to New York. I was living in New Haven at the time, I think, and I was told to come to a studio, and I went to the studio, and in the studio was one engineer named Uno Schultz and myself, and we made an album. Basically, we recorded everything with 2 mics in stereo, and I would go over a song. If I made a mistake, I would go over it again, and once I got it right, that was it. We didn't record the whole thing and then listen and then redo it. And we did the whole thing maybe in 1-2 sessions. I think 2 sessions. And then he did all the editing. And if there, any sound reverb or EQ or any of that stuff, he did it. I made some decisions about, on the original album, there's a long empty space between the song before the last, and then Last the Unicorn is the last song on the album. So there's a big space between the song before Ask the Unicorn and Ask the Unicorn, because I wanted everybody to just pause before they heard that song. It seemed best. So I made decisions like that. But basically that's how we made it. I am interested in how many copies were recorded or made. Do you own a copy yourself? Yes, I own a copy. I just have 1 copy. How many copies? I don't know how many copies they made. I haven't a clue. They made enough that they were in stores across the country. I would be really happy to hear a short story of your teen life before 1968. Well, I was in high school. I belonged to 3 choirs. I belonged to the a cappella choir in Stanford High School, Stanford, Connecticut. I belonged to the church choir, and I belonged to the YMCA choir. I pretty much kept to myself. My parents had moved from my neighborhood, where I had friends, and not very far, but still, to a place where there weren't any other teenagers anywhere around, even though there were a lot of houses and stuff around. And so aside from at school, I didn't really have any friends when I went home. I mean, nothing. I had no social life whatsoever. I just was by myself all the time. And I probably spent my time making art, mostly. And one important thing was, and it was the reason I was in two of the choirs, was around the time I was a teenager, I started going to my mother's church uptown in Stanford. And this is a Stanford that before any of the corporations moved in. I belonged to the Methodist Youth Fellowship, and so I had always been in school. I'd always been in the, because I have a slow reading speed and my spelling's atrocious, I was always put in the lowest intelligent group, which meant I could get really good marks really easily, or pretty good marks, but it was kind of not great from the social point of view. But at the church, there was a group of, suddenly I met all these kids who were considered the most intelligent kids in high school, and I got to hang out with them. And I found, to my amazement, that I had no problem dealing with those kids, and they welcomed me, and they were fun to be with. But again, it was the sort of thing that once I left church, those relationships only existed at church and related events. But once I left, when I went home, I never saw any of those kids, either from school or from church.